This blog post is a large-scale overview of just what is concept-based learning. So most of the blog posts here are this kind of small scale. They're what's immediately in front of you. And teachers often want this because they're in a classroom and you want strategies that are going to work. Where do I turn, left or right? Sometimes some of the blog posts here are a little bit more strategic. So they're about maybe a strategy or an approach rather than the immediate classroom. And they might look more like this kind of a map, metaphorically. But metaphorically, this is what this map is. It's not particularly useful if you're in a classroom right up close. If you wanted to navigate between two streets in Canberra, where I currently am, this map's not going to help you. But what it does do is just lets you know, okay, here's where I'm situated. This is the landscape around me, and this is how I came to be here. And that's what this post is intended as. There aren't many of these posts. Very big picture, very big scale. Not immediately useful, but really helpful to navigate yourself. So, concept-based learning, or concept-based curriculum instruction, or concept-based teaching and learning, whatever you want to call it, is generally referring to this, and I'll read it: a set of constructivist educational beliefs and practices, that could be and or, that emphasize the way that learners form concepts in order to organize knowledge or skills, and the way learners make inferences about these conceptual categories and their interrelationships. So it depends who's talking and who's using the words. That it could be about the belief, or it could be about the practice. It could be more about concepts, or it could be more about their interrelationship. But essentially, that's what concept-based teaching and learning is. And anything that uses the phrase concept-based has to do with that. The opposite is probably behaviorism, the belief in the sort of immediate and transparent sharing of skills and knowledge, and that humans don't really make sense of the world, they just copy things. Whereas concept-based teaching and learning isn't that. It really helps if you want to dig a bit deeper to start thinking about where it comes from, and then it makes a little bit more sense. So let's do that. Big picture, big map. The question that you can ask yourself is, how do you write down learning? How would you do that? How do you go about that? And people have come up with different answers over the last 50, 60 years. The first answer was a kind of syllabus plus exam model. And this was probably prevalent through from about the 1960s into the 70s. And in some countries, in the UK where I'm from, sort of late 70s, 80s was when learning started to get written down. The IB started a bit earlier. And they'd list topics. So a topic might sound syllabus, simultaneous equations, solving for x then y, application to real life situations. Or post-colonial texts, cultural hegemony, writing back, alterity, the canon, cultural capital. And it just names a kind of topic or area to look at. And then there's probably an exam. And then the exam might have criteria, like these are still in use, which is a bit embarrassing, in the IB English curriculum for IB, where how do you know they've understood the topic? Well, there's good understanding of the passage, or maybe even very good understanding of the passage. And the odd thing here, you'll notice that the topic's named and an evaluative judgment's made, but actually nowhere is it clear what the actual learning goal is. And I think this particular example is going to vanish quite soon, and it's probably one of the last ones to do so. So that was how people started to try to write down learning. And it seems quite reasonable. List what they're going to study, and then tell them what the scoring is going to be like on the exam at the end. The thing that replaced it had a lot going for it. So in some countries, notably areas in Australia, university systems that still sometimes use this, people said, okay, well, it's not about what they study and then a test in which you norm people. It should be about what they actually learn as a result of doing that. So let's write down the learning that happens at the end. And this is an example, like students should be able to understand, analyse and interpret historical events, conditions and trends and issues to develop historical perspective. It sounds great, and it's a massive improvement over the last, but it has real problems. If this outcome says at the end of a course taught by multiple teachers, or at the end of schooling with multiple grades, like how do you backmap that? Who decides who's going to do what in which grades? How do you make sure there's not repetition? How do you make sure it's not fluffy? How do you make sure there's kind of a shared interpretation of what it means? And so, despite the fact that outcomes-based education was a very significant step forward, in most places where it's implemented, it was seen to fail. The exception to this currently seems to be in some university settings, but in a school setting, largely it failed. And in places like Australia, where it was implemented very broad scale, it was subsequently withdrawn. And the thing that replaced it is, okay, let's name at a grade level rather than a huge outcome. Let's name at grade level or chunk level exactly what the knowledge and skills are that students need. So let's say that students have to identify common attributes of industrialization. Let's say students can analyze the social and economic consequence of industrialization in a case study. Or let's say we want students to solve and create simultaneous equations. You can see how this related to the earlier examples, but it feels much more precise. It's an improvement. There are problems with it though. The problems with it are that if you take learning down to small chunks in order to liberate students and let them own their learning, it can often become a kind of bureaucratic tick list. Teaching can become very atomistic, taught in small chunks to make sure particular goals are ticked off. But the whole point about the goals is they're complementary, but you can't name what that complementary thing is because it's something slightly bigger, so that holds it together, that you haven't named and isn't measured or taught anymore. The very thing that's supposed to become liberating for students can become a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare. And because there's no differentiation of grain size, when it comes to reporting, you kind of have to report everything. So you end up with these gigantic lists of outcomes and whether students have met them, which look impressive, but they don't actually represent the learning very well, and they're not very easy to interpret. And when it comes to skill areas, they're actually surprisingly vague. You start asking, well, what do you mean analyze? Define analyze. And so it doesn't help as much as it looks like, and this caused problems. The problems are solved to a large extent by concept-based. And what concept-based would do is say, okay, you want students to solve and create simultaneous equations. Why? And Lynn Erickson suggests using the phrase, in order to understand what? And in this case, you might say, okay, in order to understand that substitution is an effective strategy for eliminating variables when problem solving and solution finding. And now I've actually named the understanding. In the earlier one, there was a verb that might, something from Bloom's taxonomy, and people often thought, well, that must mean it's an understanding. But just sticking analyze on the front of a topic doesn't make it an understanding. But beginning to name the concepts that are being used to organize knowledge and skill, ideas about substitution, strategy, variables, problem solving, and naming their relationship lifts it to a different level. And again, the second example, okay, students can analyze these factors, if we agree what analyze means, but that's not particularly helpful. But it's extremely helpful to say this would be an example of understanding that historians divide consequences into short and long term in order to understand relative significance. And these understandings let you begin to transfer knowledge between different examples, see the bigger picture, make connections, critically think in a way that the standards-based goals just didn't. This is about understanding, standards-based is about knowledge and skill. Having said that, the understandings are there to frame knowledge and skill, not replace it. So a question might be, well, did that just come out of nowhere? And no, it absolutely didn't. There are loads of places you could start. Plato is a common one, but to take a more recent frame, you might start with Piaget and his research into how children form conceptual understandings and concepts. You might sort of then look through a whole range of thinkers from Hilda Tabether or Ausubel or Novak, all of whom explored throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, up into the 80s, the ways in which children form conceptual understandings. Lynn Erickson did a fantastic job of framing and popularizing and giving a structure to some of their writings, and her books about concept-based teaching and learning and some of the diagrammatic work she did really help people to understand the alternative to something like standards-based. Before moving on in this very big picture map, it's worth noting that you might say, does that mean we can write down understanding now? And we've finally got to the stage where that question of can we write down learning? Yes, we can write down learning. The answer is going to be no, and it's always going to be no. And the answer is in Derrida, who points out you can never purely transmit something that's in the mind. So if I write down that understanding, you'd say, what is that what's in someone's brain? And they say, yes, that's the understanding, short-term, long-term consequences. You can just start asking questions like, tell me what you mean by the name consequences or the concept consequences, and you'll get an explanation. And during that explanation, someone might mention causality, and you say, that's interesting, tell me about causality. And they'll give you an explanation using another word, and they might use the word sort of cause and effect, and you might say, oh, that's interesting, tell me about effect. And it will never stop. And that's Derrida's simple but brilliant point, really, that language is self-referential. You never get to the thought itself. You never get to learning or understanding. Having said that, to go over to Nietzsche, Nietzsche's point that ideas don't have to be true, they have to be useful, is really good here. Concept-based learning can be incredibly powerful in helping students think better and in helping us teach better to make sure we're allowing them to think and not just trying to pass on knowledge and skills. So it's not the case that the problem of how do you write down learning has been solved. It absolutely hasn't, and it probably never will be. Well, no, I can take out the probably. It won't be solved. But is this far more useful than what went before? Yes, it absolutely is. So the question might be, okay, if I write down learning like this, does that mean I can help learners learn more effectively? The answer to that is also yes, and that's the key point, really. Going back to Nietzsche, it's useful. Doesn't matter if it's true, it matters if it's useful. The stages of concept-based learning that it allows you to see is that concepts built from knowledge and skills need to be acquired explicitly by students. It's not enough to just teach knowledge and skill and hope it happens or ignore it. So what this allows to do is focus on concept acquisition, concept formation, and that's through a process of assimilation and accommodation from Piaget. Assimilation meaning firming up and consolidating ideas. Accommodating means stretching them and thinking of new examples. And once we have concepts, like significance, consequence, historical revolution, economic effect, we can start seeing how they're related in particular examples, and we can form conceptual relationships. And again, conceptual relationships form in the same way. Firstly, through assimilation, spotting similarities and patterns and consolidating them. And secondly, through accommodation, finding exceptions, finding contexts where they don't work, testing them out, seeing their limitations. And if you look at any concept-based text that suggests teaching strategies, behind it will be this very simple structure. You might wrap more on. You might look at engagement, you might look at problem-based learning, you might look at simulations, you might look at service learning, you might look at reflection, fine, but they're all being wrapped around that basic structure. And it's powerful. And that's what most of the blog posts in this blog are about. They're either concept formation or conceptual relationships. That leaves out a small debate though, which is Lynn Erickson, and here writing with Lois Lanning and Rachel French, argue strongly that teaching should be inductive. So if you present students with examples, they can use induction, which is a kind of inference to spot patterns and similarities that can either be concepts or conceptual relationships. And they call that inductive because you're using induction, going from examples to rules. That's not the only way of thinking of it. So Ausubel, in Meaningful Verbal Learning, argued almost the opposite, but also for concept-based. So his point was that if you prime cognitive schemas for students, you name the kind of relationships you're going to explore, and then present material that's organized in a way that allows students to consolidate and test understandings, then it's really effective. I'm at least 70% with Lynn Erickson here, but I would make a small refinement. I think the real question is not, is it inductive? Because I think in areas like mathematics, you generate knowledge deductively through proof. You don't need to tell students the proof. You can ask them to work through it and ask them what must follow from this. It's just a different way of making an inference. I think the real distinction is, do you want students to make inferences to generate their own knowledge, or do you just want to tell them? So I think it would be better to see the contrast as, do you want inferential teaching or declarative teaching? Again, I'm 70% on the left with Lynn Erickson and Rachel French and Lois Lanning, but I've been in a Lynn Erickson workshop and she did most of the learning through declarative. So I think if we're honest with ourselves, we'd say that understandings that students form themselves are extremely powerful and long-lasting, and it teaches them to critically think. And they get a real pleasure and motivation from that feeling of efficacy. Having said that, there is still quite a lot of teaching, even by gurus like Lynn Erickson, that's actually declarative. But that too should be strongly conceptual in nature and allow students to make connections. And after all, constructivism is what happens inside your head, it's not the teaching method. And that's always worth remembering. Constructivism is a theory of how people learn, not a theory of how they're taught. So that's a really big map, and it's not necessarily particularly helpful for finding a skate shop in the middle of Canberra, which is what I was trying to do. But it's really good if someone says, where are you, why are you here? And you can sort of situate yourself a bit more broadly. We have a rubric at UWC-SEA that we're currently using to think about this big picture of where we are in our practice for concept-based teaching and learning. And again, that helps us navigate in this map of, okay, well, where are we and where do we need to be? And for the close-up kind of street guides of, okay, I get it, but I still just want to know how to navigate my classroom, I think there are great books out there, and there are more books coming out. I know sort of this year, next year, and I'm sure in following years, many more books on this subject are coming out as the penny drops for lots of people about how powerful this is. And the concept blog is designed to be more of the street guide itself. One of the things I found most interesting about reading about this was the transition from syllabus-based learning to outcomes-based before the jump to standards-based, which is well known, and concept-based, which there are many books on. And there's just a couple of texts here I've put which I found really interesting about outcomes-based learning and why it failed. That's it for this blog post. I hope that's given you a sense of the wider landscape of concept-based. I recognise that some of it's a bit big picture and a bit abstract, but I think it really helps us navigate where we are with concept-based teaching and learning.